Thank you for joining today in our Peace Partylist webinar series. For today's very important topic, education and taxes, we're going to find out from our resource speaker how to properly tax educational institutions. On behalf of Attorney Princess Abante Barquilla, our Peace Partylist Chief Legal Officer, I am Ms. Roda Alegre, the Secretary General of Peace Partylist, and I will be your host for today's seminar. Taong 2020 nang dinulat ng COVID-19 virus ang buong mundo kung saan halos lahat ng ekonomiya ay naapektuhan ng labis. Maraming nagsarang mga negosyo, paaralan at kahit mga simbahan dahil hindi kinaya ang patuloy na pananalanta ng pandemya. Dito sa ating bansa, inuulat ng ating Peace Partylist President, Mrs. Abante, na mahigit 846 private schools ang nagsara dahil sa mababang enrollment at ito ay nagdulot ng pagkawala ng trabaho ng napakaraming private schools and private school teachers and personnel. Dahil sa walang kasiguraduhan kung kailan mapupuksa at titigil ang COVID-19 virus sa kanyang pananalanta, kumilos ang ating gobyerno at bumuo at gumawa ng batas ang ating Kongreso ng isang tax relief na tinatawag nilang Create Law of 2021. Halos ang lahat ay natuwa sa dulot at tulong ng Create Law. Ngunit mayroong nag-iisang sektor na pinalungkot nito ng labis at ito ang ating sektor, ang pribadong mga paaralan. Let me call Pastor Joey, our Peace Board Director, to open our webinar with a prayer.
Okay, shall we pray? We thank you, Lord, for your loving care, for your protection and guidance throughout 1 year and 7 months of being under this pandemic. We come to you today with faith and trust that we can face and still put our shield of faith in this time of pandemic. We bring to you, Lord, the administrators, the principals, every private schools, professors, teachers, staff, the maintenance of our school, and every private schools that are affected by this. Lord, in our performance of our duty as educators, we continue to do the teaching ministry that you have given us. We pray for your blessing over our lives, over our ministries, over our livelihoods and our family. Will you please help us to be guided by your wisdom? Empower us as we face another challenge this school year 2021-2022. We ask that the parents, the guardians, the caregivers will not be out of job, but they will still continue enrolling their kids to our school. And as we face this unprecedented challenge, help us that we will make decisions that we will always be dependent upon your wisdom, understanding, and insight. We may feel overwhelmed at this present time, but we're never alone and abandoned. You strengthen us from within. We are so thankful for the strength and the confidence that you are giving us. And Lord, we thank you for BP Benny Abante, Ma'am Pepat, Attorney Princess, and our resource speaker, Attorney Tyra Marbas, that we will be having today. May you bless Ma'am Roda as she becomes our moderator today. Thank you for the people that are watching. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Joey, and for our warm welcome remarks and to give you a brief background of our organization and the advocacies we are pursuing and advancing, let me call our beloved Peace Partylist President, Mrs. Maripasti Abante.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. It is my hope and prayer that as we talk, as the webinar will be about a topic that many of us don't understand. Me, myself, I don't understand it. And I'm glad we have accountants in every organization that we have that takes care of it. Today, just like Ms. Roda said, this is a webinar about taxation, especially to our small Christian private schools. This is one of the things that are making us hard in the ministry that we have. And I'm glad that today, the things that we want to do as a small schools will be able to be explained to us by a very reliable speaker. The Peace Partylist, who is the sponsor of this webinar, is an organization or a party list for educators like us. I realize, and I have seen this, that during this pandemic, if there's one area in our society that has been affected, are the small private Christian schools. I personally know of 2 schools around us. We have a school in Manila. Two of our neighboring schools have closed down because many of their students transferred to the public schools where they are not going to pay. And because of that, they cannot sustain the school. And one of the things that makes it hard to sustain it is the taxation or the tax that is imposed to us. There's nothing wrong for us to pay taxes. I believe in paying taxes, but I am praying that our government, through the representation of this Peace Party List, would be able to come up of a scheme where we will not be taxed as much as that big private schools, but we are willing to pay our taxes, but in accordance to the income that our school is receiving. So today, to all of you, despite of this heavy rain going on outside, welcome to an exciting webinar today. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you, Mrs. Tabante. At panoorin po muna natin ang Peace Primer.
Sa wakas, nagtinig na kaming mga naniniwala sa edukasyong dekalidad at tunay na nagpapatatag sa ating bayan tungo sa maunlad na kinabukasan. Handa na kaming sumigaw, handa na kaming humiyaw. Peace tayo, programang makapuluhan. Peace tayo, advokasya at panindigan. Peace tayo, sama-sama nating sulong ang kaunlaran ng bayan. Itaguyod natin ang bukas ngayon, pagkakaisa natin ang siyang tugon. Peace tayo, programang makabuluhan. Peace tayo, advokasya at panindigan. Peace tayo, sama-sama nating sulong ang kaunlaran ng bayan.
Okay, maraming salamat para sa ating beloved President, sa kanyang warm welcome sa atin ngayong umaga. For today's resources speaker, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Attorney Teresa F. Lorbas of SGV and Company. She will inform us and equip us and the public, of course, about the changes in the tax system, present the highlights of the CREATE law, which includes amendments to several provisions of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 on corporate income taxation. Attorney Marbas is the SGV tax partner. She has diverse experience in providing business tax services to clients from the power, manufacturing, consumer products, tobacco, business process outsourcing, automotive, and agricultural industries. She was a tax quality reviewer for EY Vietnam. She is also an active facilitator for SGV's training programs and the speaker for SGB's public tax seminars. Attorney Marbas completed her Bachelor of Science degree in accountancy at the Ateneo de Davao University, where she also obtained her Juris Doctor degree. Attorney Marbas is a CPA lawyer. Attorney Marbas completed the Executive Management Program of the National University of Singapore Business School in June 2019. She is the recipient of the SGB Special Award twice, first in 2015 and another in 2018 as a team member. So, everyone, let us welcome Attorney Marbas to our PEACE webinar series on education and taxes.
Okay, thank you, Rhoda, for that kind introduction. Again, it is my pleasure to. Um, Hello, can you hear me? And can you confirm if you can see my slides?
Yes, Attorney.
Oh, good. Okay. Once again, thank you, Rhoda, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to share my insights regarding a difficult topic about taxation. I know our audience are quite mixed. We have teachers or members of the board in private schools. So I hope I can simplify the topic for you. And then we'll be open later for question and answer as we go along. So I'll be discussing specifically, I know it is quite a create revenue regulations created quite a stir for non-stock non-profit organizations. As mentioned earlier, the impact of COVID is quite heavy for private schools, especially with this new arrangement, and plus this interpretation issued by the BIR regarding the amendments to the relevant provisions of CREATE created a headache for educational institution. But let me break it down for you for your understanding. And then later on, I'll be also walking you through on what are the process for applying for a tax exemption certificate. Okay. So before we go to the meat of what was the amendment brought about by CREATE, let me just walk you through on the history of taxability of educational institutions on the under the tax code. So under the 1968 tax code, it mentions private educational institutions other than those exempt under 27E shall be subject to the 10% tax of their taxable income. And then it went through an amendment in 1977 which added private educational institutions, whether stock or non-stock, shall pay a tax of 10%. So in the past, 1977 tax code, private educational institutions, whether stock or non-stock, were subjected to 10%. And then 1986 tax code, it further mentions it still retained private educational institutions, whether stock or non-stock. So, but here comes the 1987 Constitution. Kasi in the past, as we mentioned, even non-stock, non-profit educational institutions in the past were subjected to the preferential rate of 10%. But with the 1987 Constitution, it mentions that all revenues and assets of non-stock, non-profit educational institutions used actually, directly, and exclusively for educational purposes shall be exempt from taxes and duties. And upon the dissolution or cessation of the corporate existence of such institutions, their assets shall be disposed in the manner provided by law. So it further mentions that proprietary educational institutions, including those cooperatively owned, may likewise be entitled to such exemption subject to limitations provided by law, including restrictions on dividends and provisions for reinvestment. So under the 1987 Constitution, non-stock, non-profit educational institutions enjoy exemption from its income from educational activities, including its ancillary services. Now, where is this confusion coming from? Whether non-stock, non-profit educational institution compared to private educational institutions who are profit, the taxability of these entities. So we'll divide it by two: non-stock, non-profit, and then proprietary schools, which are non-profit. Okay. So, in the 1997 tax code, it provides proprietary educational institutions and hospitals which are non-profit. So, more or less, it's the same provision to the 1986 tax code. What was amended from the 1986 tax code to the 1997 tax code is this provision: a proprietary educational institution, the one highlighted in red. So more or less, in comparison to create law, more or less it's the same. It provides the taxability of proprietary educational institutions and hospitals which are non-profit. What was amended between the 1997 tax code and create law are the ones highlighted in red. It provided that beginning July 1, 2020 until June 30, 2023, the tax imposed for these two entities, proprietary educational institutions and hospitals, which are nonprofit, will be at 1%. And then after June 30, 2023, it will revert to 10%. Supposedly, the intention of our lawmakers when they amended this provision of the tax code is to provide temporary relief to educational institutions and even hospitals, um, for to brace themselves on the impact of the COVID pandemic. So it allowed a reduction of the taxability or tax rate from 10% to 1%. And then the additional item that was amended by Create Law is this provision. Proprietary, unlike 1997 tax code, what was defined is proprietary educational institution. In the Create Law, it was amended. It now reads proprietary means a private hospital or any private school. So those are the amendments brought about by Create. Now, again, this is Section 27. In contrast, Section 30H of the tax code was not amended by Create Law. So, for reference, it mentions that Section 30, the following organizations shall be taxed under this title and exempt supposedly from taxes. So, under letter H, it mentions a non-stock, non-profit educational institution supposedly are exempt from taxes. While Section 27 provides taxability for proprietary educational institutions to 10%. How are these different? Um, the issuance of this Revenue Regulations 5-2021 is the one that created confusion on the taxability of educational institutions. Okay? Because under RR 5-2021, it defined now proprietary educational institution as would refer to any private schools which are non-profit. So this was the definition in this regulation. So what does this mean? So proprietary educational institutions accordingly are those private schools which are nonprofit. With this interpretation or definition of proprietary, it seems that even non-stock nonprofit schools would now be taxed at 1% or 1% temporarily, and then after June 30, 2023, it will come back to 10%. So this was the confusion. How do we reconcile Section 27 from Section 30? Okay. And then nonprofit was defined in that revenue regulations as, of course, no net income or asset accrues to or benefits any member or specific person. So, and then BIR further issued after the revenue regulations, RMC 62-2021. Part of the question and answer in that RMC is that the question was, are private educational institutions distributing dividends to shareholders taxable at the regular corporate income tax rates of either 25 or 20%? According to that RMC, they answered that question as yes, because the law is very specific that the preferential rate of 10% or 1% shall be imposed to proprietary educational institution, which is defined as any private schools which are nonprofit. So basically, this the revenue regulations in RMC now mentions that non-stock nonprofit educational institutions will now be taxed at 1% until 2023 and 10% instead of being treated as an exempt entity, which is the provision under the Constitution as well as Section 30. Now, while private educational institutions who are for profit and distributes dividends will now be taxed at 25%. In the past, the treatment is they are the ones subject to 10%. So this is the confusion because of this RMC. If you ask me which is the proper interpretation, in my humble opinion, supposedly Section 27 is applicable to two kinds of entities. One, proprietary educational institutions, which means non-stock and are for profit. And then hospitals, which are non-profit. So for hospitals which are for profit, supposedly they're the ones subject to 25%. Hospitals which are non-profit, they would be subject to the 10% rate. Okay. So proprietary educational institutions who are for profit, supposedly they are the ones subject to 1 or 10%. But those educational institutions who are private and non-profit should be covered by Section 30 instead of Section 27, which means their income is supposedly subject to exemption. So Section 30, on top of that, we have the constitutional provision that I mentioned to you earlier. So this was the confusion. So I understand a lot of interest groups have already written to BIR to clarify the interpretation as well as to DOF, but we're still waiting for their response regarding the confusion created by both RR5-2021 and RMC 62-2021. Educational institutions who are nonprofit are supposedly exempt under the Constitution as well as under Section 30H of the Tax Code. While for educational institutions who are stock and even for profit, they are the ones supposedly subject to the 1% and then eventually go back to 10% by June 30, 2023. Schools that are schools that are supposedly subject to 25% are those schools, even though they are stock and for profit, but if their gross income from unrelated activities will exceed 50%, they are the ones supposedly subject to the 25% or regular tax rate. Okay? So I hope, again, we're still waiting for the DOF and BIR to formally respond to the inquiry and provide some clarity regarding the interpretation. Okay. So what does the 1997 tax code limit? Does the 1997 tax code limit the 10% tax to proprietary educational institutions, which are nonprofit, as interpreted by RR 5-2021, or does that phrase only qualify hospitals? Again, even in the De La Salle case, Supreme Court decision in the De La Salle case, the Supreme Court held that what should apply for non-stock, non-profit educational institution is not Section 27, but Section 30H of the tax code. And in fact, Section 30H of the tax code qualifies other income not arising necessarily from educational activities, including ancillary activities as operations of canteen. Um, Under Section 30H, it will be subject to taxes. But according to the De La Salle case, according to the Supreme Court, even the income of non-stock, non-profit educational institution from ancillary activities, for as long as the proceeds thereof are being used for its educational purposes, will also enjoy exemption. Okay? Although part of the, although there was a discussion in the De La Salle case, but we think that this is just an obiter or was just discussed in passing. The Supreme Court somehow discussed that a proprietary educational institution that are entitled to the 10% corporate income tax rate are those proprietary educational institutions that are nonprofit. So this is where the confusion is coming from, because even in the Supreme Court decision had a discussion that those that will be subject to 10% are proprietary educational institution that are nonprofit. But we think this is just an obiter. Again, for non-stock, non-profit educational institution, what should apply is Section 30H and the constitutional provision on exemption of income of non-stock, non-profit educational institution, subject again to the condition that these are actually and directly and exclusively used in its educational purposes. So even in RMO 44-2016, of course, this is pre-create. During that time, there was a confusion whether or not what will apply, Section 30H, Section 27. Under this RMO, the BIR has clarified and has recognized that notwithstanding the provisions of Section 30H, last paragraph, subjecting income from other activities of educational non-stock non-profit institutions to tax will not apply, such that it will continue to enjoy exemption for as long as the proceeds of those ancillary activities will be used in its educational purposes. So even this RMO 44-2016 acknowledged the supremacy of the Constitution over the tax code. Again, we have a principle in law, in terms of hierarchy of law, the Constitution is higher, and then a general law, such as the tax code, would be subservient to the Constitution. So according to this RMO, they will follow the provisions of the Constitution instead of the last paragraph of Section 30H of the tax code. So how will we apply Section 27B to taxability of nonprofit hospitals? This is a relevant decision also. The St. Luke's Medical Center. In most of the BIR audits that I'm handling for my educational non-stock nonprofit schools, BIR in assessing the non-stock nonprofit schools to 10%, even prior to 10% rate, even prior to create, they use the St. Luke's Medical Center case. Okay, but again, in contrast, St. Luke's is applicable to non-profit hospital. In this particular case, the Supreme Court defined what is proprietary as meaning to be it's a privately operated school. Non-profit was defined as no net income or asset accrues to or benefits any member or specific person. with all the net income or assets devoted to the institution's purposes and all its activities conducted not for profit. So for non-stock non-profit educational institution, if in case BIR will assess you at the rate of 10% using St. Luke's Medical Center, we can argue that St. Luke's Medical Center should not be applied to us. Instead, the De La Salle case should be applied, such that it recognized that all income of the educational non-stock non-profit institution are exempt, subject to the condition as I have discussed earlier. Okay? So again, we're still waiting for the formal response of the DOF and the BIR to clarify this confusion. But in the meantime, I understand there are already pending bills to amend the taxability to once and for all settle the issue. I understand there are House Bills number 9573, 9577, and 9596, an act amending Section 27B of the NIRC or the tax code. The principal authors in the House of Representatives are Congressman Benitez, Rufus Rodriguez, and Joey Salceda. The status, it's still pending for first reading. And then we have also a House bill or a bill pending with House Bill number 1877, resolution urging BIR to revoke revenue regulations number 5-2021. The principal author is Representative Mark Go. So again, those are the measures being undertaken by our lawmakers regarding the confusion created by RR 5-2021. And then we also have a Senate Bill number 2272 proposing to amend also Section 27B to once and for all clarify the interpretation of Section 27. This is sponsored by Senator Sani Angara. Its status is still pending in the Committee of Ways and Means. So in the provision or the proposal of Senator Angara, it further defined Section 27 as applicable to hospitals which are non-profit and proprietary educational institutions, meaning private but not necessarily non-stock, private stock educational institutions as being subject to 10%. So hopefully we will be receiving any word from the DOF or an issuance coming from the DOF revoking 5-2021 or even clarifying the confusion created by our RR 5-2021. So again, it is my humbled opinion that non-stock, non-profit educational institutions continue to be exempt. What who are those covered by the 10% rate or 1% rate are private educational institutions that are not necessarily non-profit. Okay, so we have to differentiate those two. We were also requested to discuss with you this morning on what are the process to secure a tax exemption ruling from the BIR. So some of you might be asking, for non-stock non-profit educational institutions, our exemption are covered by the Constitution. Is there really a need for us to secure a tax exemption ruling following the issuance of the BIR? At the end of the day, our executive branch or the BIR can impose some rules. Supposedly, the intention of the BIR in requiring schools to have these tax exemption rulings is for the BIR also to check because, again, there are instances that the tax exemption or status of non-stock non-profit educational institutions are also being abused. So they would want to check non-stock non-profit schools whether they are really operating as such. Okay, but again, if you are being audited by the BIR and you don't have yet a tax exemption ruling, it will not divest you from invoking your tax exemption. But of course, you need to prove that you are really you have a tax exempt status as required under the laws. So we still suggest that you get a tax exemption ruling. How do you get the tax exemption ruling? These are the requirements under Revenue Memorandum Order number 44-2016. First, an application letter for issuance of tax exemption ruling. In that application letter, the school must mention its registration, including a provision that you are a non-stock non-profit educational institution. There are two tests, if ever, that you need to establish in your exemption ruling: the organizational test and the operations test. So meaning your organization, you need to establish that you are a non-stock non-profit entity. You can show it via your articles of incorporation issued by the SEC. Your operational requirements, meaning you need to show in your financial statements that your expenses are generally for educational purposes. Okay? So it's an application letter stating the facts and the rules that you are asking the BIR to confirm your tax exempt status. Second requirement is SEC certificate of good standing. This will be secured from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I will discuss in the subsequent slides the requirements. Third requirement is the certification under oath of the treasurer on the income and compensation to trustees, officers, and other executive officers of the school. Fourth requirement is the audited financial statements for the last 3 years when you submit your application. And then government recognition or permit or accreditation issued by the CHED, DepEd, or TESDA, as the case may be. Another requirement is the certification of utilization of annual revenues and assets to be executed by your treasurer. And then, although not in the list in RMO 44-2016, BIR will require submission of the articles of incorporation and SEC registration. So your application letter, together with all of the rest of the requirements that I discussed, will be submitted and addressed to the Office of the Assistant Commissioner, Legal Service, and attention to the Law Division of the BIR. So it was further mentioned in RMO 44-2016 that a TER, or a certificate of tax exemption, issued in particular to schools, will remain to be valid and effective unless recalled for valid grounds by the BIR. In contrast kasi to other non-stock non-profit institutions, charitable, and other activities under Section 30H, their tax exemption ruling have a validity period of 3 years. But for educational institutions under RMO 44-2016, once you are able to secure a CTE or TER, it has no effectivity period, meaning it has no expiry. It will continue to be effective unless recalled by the BIR. It was further mentioned that there is no requirement to renew or revalidate. But of course, subject to the revocation if there are material changes in the character, purpose, or method of operation of the school, then the school's TER can be invalidated or recalled. Now, a lot of my clients are asking, how do we secure, why does the BIR need submission of your articles of incorporation and SEC registration, notwithstanding that it's not in the list? The BIR will check in your articles whether these two provisions are embodied in your articles. Otherwise, if these two provisions are not in your articles, then they will disallow or deny your exemption ruling request. Okay, so what are these two provisions that they will usually look for in your articles of incorporation? It will not necessarily be provision or article 8 or 9 of your, so this is just an example. So this is what they will look for in your articles, that the school is a non-stock and non-profit, and the trustees are not entitled to receive any compensation from the corporation and net profit of which shall not inure to the benefit of any individual, but all its properties, real and personal, shall be used exclusively for educational purposes. So they would really look for this provision in your articles. If you don't have this, you can have your articles amended to incorporate this particular provision so that you are able to qualify, or BIR will issue a tax exemption ruling to you. The second provision that BIR will require to be embodied in the articles of non-stock non-profit educational institutions is this provision that upon liquidation or dissolution of the school, whatever assets may remain at the expiration of the term of the existence or dissolution for any cause provided by law, the same shall be conveyed and disposed of in trust to a successor corporation to be organized by members or to an educational institution that have the same purpose as this corporation. So if for some reason the non-stock non-profit school will liquidate in the future or dissolve, any residual assets or income will have to go to another non-stock non-profit educational institution. So it will not inure to the benefit of any trustees nor individuals. Without these two provisions, you can expect that your tax exemption ruling will be denied by the BIR. So, but of course, you are not without recourse. You can go through amendment of your articles. And then once you have the SEC approvals for your amended articles, then that's the time that you could lodge your tax exemption ruling application with the BIR. So the next question that I usually receive from my client, how do we secure the SEC certificate of good standing? This can be requested from the company registration and monitoring department of the SEC in their main office or their satellite offices. So these are the requirements: latest audited financial statements, latest general information sheet, SEC certificate, articles of incorporation, photocopy of first page of the stock and transfer book. Of course, this is not applicable, photocopy of first page of stock transfer book to non-stock non-profit corporations. So, and then next is the CRMD or CRMD clearance or company registration and monitoring department. In the CRMD monitoring, the CRMD will mention either you don't have any violations, so they will issue a CRMD clearance, or um, on the other hand, there are some instances that maybe the school failed to submit in particular year their audited financial statement or GIS. Then CRMD will impose penalties. They will not issue the clearance prior to the payment of the penalties. So once the penalties are paid, then that's the time that the CRMD will issue you a clearance. So once all of these requirements are complete, then this can be submitted to the CRMD, and then SEC will issue you the certificate of good standing. Okay, I think that's about it for my slides. I am now open to questions coming from our participants.
Thank you, Attorney Marbas. Meron po ditong isang nag-message sa akin po. Ang sabi dito, Finance Secretary Carlos G. Dominguez III, who was a signatory of RR 5 2021, has since backed BIR's position on the issue, saying it was based on the tax code as well as Supreme Court decisions in a number of landmark cases. So that's why BIR rejected Cocopea's letter appeal to rectify the tax regulation. Ano po yung masasabi niyo dito?
So yeah, again, the discussion on defining those educational institutions that would be covered by 10% as to include those are non-profit. In the De La Salle case, we think it's just an obiter, meaning it was not the main case in point in those landmark case. If you look at Section 27, you must reconcile kasi the whole provisions of the tax code. How do you reconcile Section 27 if it covers non-stock, non-profit educational institutions from Section 30H? Okay? So Section 30H, in my humble opinion, covers non-stock, non-profit educational institution. According to 30H, they are exempt. So meaning, if in contrast to Section 27, how will you differentiate it from Section 30? If Section 27 will also cover non-stock, non-profit educational institutions as being subject to 10%, it will create an absurdity kasi there is Section 30 that provides clearly for exemption, and then Section 27 will also subject them to 1 and 10%. So again, my humbled opinion, what should be applied for non-stock, non-profit educational institution is Section 30H plus the constitutional provision. Again, we have a principle in law, in terms of hierarchy of laws, constitution is supreme compared to general law such as the tax code. So that's my humbled opinion on that matter. Hopefully, the DOF would really reconsider.
So, attorney, ang recourse po ng mga uh, for-profit private educational institutions, yung, or hindi po naman po sinasabing last recourse nila yung kasi nag-file na po yung private educational stakeholders na sa Court of Tax Appeals
Mm.
na
Yeah.
they
So,
sued IR.
Go ahead, Rhoda. Yeah. Of course, we have a principle also in law that all issuances of the executive, like revenue regulations, have the presumption of regularity. This is the question now of the legality of the interpretation kasi validity of the interpretation of the DOF on the create law. One recourse, of course, writing to the DOF, but I understand my informal response na. Another recourse is to really take the issue to the courts. Issuances by the executive have presumption of regularity, or they will be considered valid until enjoined by the court or annulled by a court of competent jurisdiction. So I understand a case was already taken to the CTA, and hopefully the CTA will issue at least a TRO in the meantime while they are resolving the issue. But again, if you ask me, in my humble opinion, non-stock, non-profit educational institutions should be covered by Section 30H, not by Section 27. And then, of course, the constitutional provision exempting non-stock, non-profit educational institutions from taxes.
Ayan po, attorney, meron din po rito nagpadala sa akin ng question. Sinasabi po rito na ano daw po ang effect nung sinulat na bill ni Senator Angara, yung nire-ratify niya yung non-proprietary educational institutions.
Yeah. So supposedly, again, my interpretation is that under Section 27, there are supposedly two entities that are being taxed. Hospitals, which are non-profit, and proprietary educational institutions not covered by Section 30H, meaning private schools that are for-profit. Sila dapat yung magiging tax at 10% or 1%. So that's my interpretation of the bill of Senator Angara. So I think in the header in itself, it already mentions that hospitals which are non-profit, and then it's divided by a comma, and proprietary educational institution. Kasi the previous wording is proprietary educational institution. This was the one that created confusion, whether the non-profit would apply to both proprietary educational institutions and hospitals. But my humbled opinion, which is also the one being clarified, or the intention of Senator Angara to be clarified, is that the non-profit should only be applicable to hospitals, but not for educational institutions. Because again, non-profit educational institution is covered by Section 30H. not 27.
Apo. Thank you for that. Attorney, meron po dito question from one of our participants, from Lady Christine Salis. We are currently applying for exemption certification. The BIR required us to include, ito po yung sinabi niya, in case of dissolution, assets of the corporation shall be transferred to similar institutions or to the government in our AOI. Is the transfer to the government part necessary?
Yeah. So what's mentioned in the Constitution is that here I'm showing to you the provision. Upon dissolution or cessation of the corporate existence, their assets shall be disposed of in the manner provided by law. It does not mention really, the Constitution itself does not provide for how the assets will be disposed upon dissolution. It mentioned it will be provided by a law. The interpretation under the tax code kasi, no proceeds or no assets of the corporation or non-stock non-profit educational institution should inure to the benefit of any individual, trustees, or corporation. So the interpretation of the BIR is, or the DOF, is that upon dissolution, it should go to another educational institution, or if there's no educational if you don't elect that this proceeds of the residual assets upon dissolution will go to an educational purposes, it will inure to the benefit of the government. Again, there's no specific law providing for it, but in the interpretation of the BIR in the RMO, in their revenue memorandum issuance, they interpreted it that it will not inure to the benefit of any trustee or individual. So that's why residual income should go to a non-stock non-profit educational institution or the government, if you don't really elect one. So if you go back to the question whether that provision to the government is necessary, again, there's no rule providing for it, no law providing for it, but an RMO was issued, or revenue memorandum order was issued regarding that. Again, it has a presumption of regularity unless and until annulled. So that's the only issuance relevant, discussing what are the conditions set forth by law on the disposition of the assets. Okay?
Okay, attorney, nabanggit ko po kanina na yung create law ay ang effectivity nito ay ngayong month of June. So may provision din po doon na parang sinasabing retroactive ng July 2020. Paano po yun?
Yeah. So, yeah, in general, create law became effective last March. But there are provisions in the create law which provides for retroactive application. In general, kasi laws have prospective application unless the law itself will provide for a retroactive application and it's beneficial. Let's say for in terms of taxation law, retroactive application and it's beneficial to the taxpayer. So the law was signed in create was signed into law March and became effective 15 days. So I think April. But for this particular provision, reducing the tax rate from 10% to 1%, create law provided for a retroactive application na starting July 1, 2020. So again, the law provided specifically for retroactive application, and considering this is beneficial, the retroactive application is valid and constitutional.
Okay, sa amin pong Board of Director, Pastor Joey Salco, meron po kayong questions? Okay. Okay, habang naantay po natin si Pastor Joey at school administrator din po kasi siya. Paano po natin matutulungan po yung mga Christian schools na hindi po nakapag-deklara at na non-profit and non-stop educational institutions nila?
Ano ulit? Sorry, can you repeat the question,
Para
Roda?
mga karamihan po sa aming mga Christian private schools ay hindi po naka-declare na sila ay non-profit or non-stop educational institutions. Paano po natin sila matutulungan?
Hindi naka-declare?
Opo, karamihan po ay sa kanilang SEC, dapat po ba naka-declare kami na non-stop, non-profit?
Okay. Again, it's an option naman on what will be your structure. If the intended structure of the school is really non-stock, non-profit, then when you applied with the SEC, it should be clear when you applied there whether you are non-stock, non-profit. Meanwhile, there are also instances that there are schools that are stock and for-profit. So depende. Probably you might be asking lang, Roda, siguro if I think for non-stock non-profit schools, yung wala kasi sa kanila, for most of the clients that I have assisted in securing PER na educational non-stock non-profit educational institution, usually ang wala sa kanilang articles of incorporation are these two provisions eh. So they are non-stock non-profit, although these particular provisions are not articulated in their AOI. So we assisted our clients in amending their AOI to incorporate these two provisions.
Yes, opo. Familiar po kami dito sa provisions na ito sa SEC Articles of Import ng bawat non-profit kasi yung sa church po nilalagay na po namin yan sa mga foundations po namin kasi mandatory nga daw.
Mandatory. Mm-mm.
Pero sinabi niyo po kanina, wala naman pong law that provides for that requirement.
Mm-mm.
So,
Interpreted it, that's why this is the interpretation dun sa non-inurement of benefit to any individual. So that's why parang ang interpretation nila via the RMO is that it should go to another non-stock non-profit entity or the government. But last resort na ang government eh.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Attorney, so itong create law ay maganda sana po ang intention, ang espiritu ng batas na ito. Pero nung nirelease po ng BIR ang RR 5/2021, tinatawag po ito ngayon ng mga private educational institutions na kung may COVID-19 virus, ito ay variant, COVID variant. So, meron pa po ba? Si Pastor Joey po yata ay meron pang itatanong, karagdagang mga katanungan po.
Yeah, nawala si Pastor
Nawala.
Joey. Yeah.
Sa ating pong mga participants or school administrators, pwede po kayong magtanong kay attorney.
Yeah. So Miss Roda, you mentioned there is already one organization who took the case to court, no?
Ay, sila po yung Cocopeia.
Cocopeia. Okay.
Hindi ko lang po nakuha. Ang nag-represent po sa kanila ay si Attorney Estrada.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully the CTA will issue a TRO suspending muna the implementation of RR 5/2021.
I-file for TRO po sana. Kasi ang sabi po nila po rito, yung RR 5/2021 jacks up the corporate income tax of private schools by 150%.
Yeah, correct. Kasi noon being exempt and then ngayon subject na to 1 and 10%. Parang ang interpretation kasi private schools who are for profit, they will be taxed at 25. Non-stock non-profit educational institution subject to 1%, 10% eventually balik after June 2023.
So po kami non-stock non-profit private school po kami. Dati po ay wala namang binabayaran.
Yeah.
10%.
Correct.
to that 1% under PEACE law.
Correct, Ms. Roda.
2023, magre-revert po ulit ito sa 10%, right?
Percent.
Opo.
Yeah. But again, my humble opinion, non-profit educational institutions should not be covered by Section 27, but Section 30H of the tax code as well as the Constitution. Yes, Pastor Joe.
Attorney, I received a certification. This is not about the school, but it is about our church. Okay? Nakalagay po dito, certification. This is to certify that Bible Baptist Church of Pasay Incorporated, trade name, Bible Baptist Church of Pasay, with TIN number 0016944736, which registered address at our address, is mandated to withhold and remit the corresponding taxes on the income payments made to their suppliers of goods and services at the applicable rate of 1% and 2% respectively, with the aforementioned taxpayer being among those classified as top withholding agent, duly publicized and posted in the official website of the BIR, accordance to provision of BIR Regulation number 11/2018. This certification is issued as a proof that the above-mentioned taxpayer is included in the list of top withholding agent published in BIR website. Ano po ang ano nun?
Yeah. So, sige po. Kasi ang exemption kasi ng non-stock non-profit school, although what you mentioned is for the church itself, di ba? The church is covered by also Section 30, although a different subparagraph. The exemption kasi under the tax code for churches, even in the Constitution, covers income tax, as well as local business RPT, real property taxes. So other kinds of taxes, meaning hindi tayo exempt from other kinds of taxes.
Yeah.
So extended withholding tax kasi, we are not really the we are not really the mandatory taxpayer, although the law mandates us to withhold from certain payments to our suppliers or even to our employees. So the point being is that ang exemption kasi ng church covers income tax, as well as RPT, but it does not necessarily exclude you from complying with the other requirements under the law.
Yes.
In a withholding agent, let's say if you rent out a certain place kasi wala pa kayong structure ninyo where you hold your place of worship, then your rental will be subject to 5% withholding tax, meaning pay your rent to your lessor, you have to withhold and remit it to the BIR. If the church or even the school have employees, you are also required to withhold from their salaries. So it does not exempt a school or a church from their obligation as a withholding agent under the tax code.
Thank you, ma'am, for that clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you po, ma'am. Thank you, attorney.
So for schools, although not part of my discussion earlier, you are also exempt from VAT for all of your tuition fees, as well as your ancillary activities. So operations of a canteen, dormitory, bookstore, all of those will be covered by your VAT exemption. But if you are engaged in other activities aside from yung tuition fees and other ancillary activities, it will be covered by the VAT rules. Let's say, I understand there are some schools that are renting out to commercial businesses yung kanilang particular area in the school. If yung lease mo or rental from those, ang interpretation ni BIR, it will be subject to VAT if it's more than 3 million. Kasi parang hindi na daw siya part of your ancillary activity. But for income tax purposes, if you plow back yung even though it's subject to VAT, but for income tax purposes, if you plow back your income from renting out to commercial businesses, then it will continue to enjoy income tax exemption, but not necessarily VAT. Okay?
Attorney, meron pa pong isang tanong from Pastor Tan Apare of Bohol. Nag-try po kami mag-apply as non-stock non-profit, pero kailangan pa naming mag-re-apply ng tax exempt. Pero that was 7 years ago. ibinalik po at hindi kami na-approve. So mula noon po kami ay nagbabayad na ng tax sa BIR. Ang aming pong school ay Liberty Christian Academy of Panglao, Incorporated.
Yeah. I don't know, Miss Rhoda, what was the reason for the denial? So, probably I advise you have to check ano yung letter ni BIR. What was the reason of the BIR in denying your exemption ruling? Probably I understand, I think for most of the denial is yung wala nga itong provisions na ito sa AOI. So probably, Pastor, you really have to check what was the reason of the BIR for the denial. And if the denial can be corrected, like etong kulang na provision sa AOI, you can pursue an amendment of your articles. So you have to check what are the reasons, and then from there, lodge another application if you're able to correct kung meron mang dapat i-correct sa previous applications ninyo.
Okay, so meron pa po ba tayong nakikita mga questions dito? Salamat daw po, attorney, sa inyong sagot. Sabi po ni Pastor San Aparo.
You're welcome, Pastor.
Sa aking nag-message si Ma'am Simple Havate na nanonood po daw po ang mga taga Mindoro Occidental, some private schools po sa ating webinar today. Thank you po at kasama rin po sila Ma'am Jocelyn ng Baguio. Thank you Ma'am for watching us. Mga private Christian schools po ito na nire-represent po ng PEACE Partylist attorney. And meron pa po ba tayong katanungan, Pastor Joey? Kasama ko po si Pastor Joey. Salamat din po kay, nandito rin po ang staff po ni attorney, si Ma'am Grace. Thank you po sa pag-assist sa amin.
Wala na po ako makita nagtatanong doon, pero siguro po nasagot na po ni attorney lahat po yung tinatawag na mga answer. At in case, ma'am, attorney, siguro pagka may mga iba pang mga inquiries na nahihiya siguro magtanong iba mga pastor, siguro po we will coordinate with Ma'am Rhoda and Ma'am Attorney Princess tungkol po sa tsaka WPT.
Yes po. Sure, sir. You can always send out your queries. I would be happy to help. Again, hopefully, really, it could either be the DOF will act on the request. If not, the court will decide. This is now really a question of validity or legality of the interpretation of the DOF. And the court will be the proper venue to resolve if DOF themselves will not retract or clarify the confusion. So in the meantime, I think the question of our educational institution, what will be the treatment? Hopefully, really, the CTA will issue a TRO. So it will give you a comfort level that you continue to enjoy your exemption. Hopefully, it will be resolved by the time na mag-submit na tayo ng annual ITR natin, which is usually April 15, the following year, di ba? Or for some of you, under a fiscal year period. Kasi at the end of the day naman, for income tax purposes, ang final natin na declaration is the annual ITR, di ba? So in the meantime, while the confusion is being, I understand, at least for some of my clients, they will continue to take a position that they are exempt. And let's see na lang on how the court will react, the BIR will react once they file their annual income tax return.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Attorney Marbas. At siya ay may puso para sa ating sektor dahil sabi po niya kanina sa amin, sa board members po ay siya ay anak ng isang pastor din.
Yes,
Amen.
I'm a PK.
So much po. At meron po tayong nahanap na kakampi na magtatanggol. Yung pong mga options or proper steps na dapat natin gawin ay natakal naman po ni Attorney Marbas this morning. Tayo ay mag-a-apply ng tax exemption. Kailangan ay meron tayong mga karampatang documents na mapapakita sa BIR. At ang ginagawa nga po ngayon ay tinutulungan din tayo ng ating Kongreso na ma-rectify itong error ng BIR regulation or policy na yung variant na tinatawag na R5 2021. And for that, ako po yata magbibigay ng closing remarks. Maraming salamat, ma'am. We are so blessed na kayo po ang aming naging resource speaker at sa ating mga kasamahan na nanonood ngayong araw na ito. Maraming salamat po. Sana po nakatulong po ang mga paliwanag sa ating Attorney Marbas at tayo ay sama-samang manalangin po na ang CPA ay maglabas na po ng kanilang resolution para ma-resolve ang confusion caused by this BIR policy. At tatawagin ko na po sa atin ang isa sa amin, ma'am, na mga PEACE board member, one of the PEACE board members, Engineer Efren Gatapia, for our closing prayer.
Salamat po, Ma'am Rhoda. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the time you've given us to have this webinar. Thank you for Attorney Marbas. Oh God, ay pagpalain po sana siya, kanyang family, ang kanyang trabaho, Panginoon. Continue to bless our members, our sympathizers, our followers sa PEACE Partylist, our officers, and even the board members, Panginoon. Kayo po magpala sa bawat isa sa amin, Panginoon. Pagpalain niyo po sana ang araw na ito. Salamat po sa mga information na share sa amin ngayong umagang ito. Naway gamitin niyo po ang PEACE Partylist para po makatulong pa sa marami pang mga institusyon, lalong-lalo po ang institusyon ng edukasyon, Panginoon. Salamat po, naway pagpalain niyo po ang bawat isa sa amin. Sa pangalan po ng Panginoong Hesukristo, dalangin po ang lahat ng ito. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you po.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. God bless you.
Thank you, Attorney.
Bye.
Thank you. Peace, peace. Coach, thank you,
Sa wakas, nagtingin na kaming mga naniniwala sa edukasyong dekalidad at tunay na nagpapatatag sa ating bayan tungo sa maunlad na kinabukasan. Handa na kaming sumigaw, handa na kaming humiyaw. Peace tayo, programang makapuluhan. Peace tayo, advocacy at panindigan. Peace tayo, sama-sama nating sulong ang kaunlaran ng bayan. Itaguyod natin ang bukas ngayon, pagkakaisa natin ang siyang tugon. Peace tayo, programang makabuluhan. Peace tayo, advocacy at panindigan. Peace tayo, sama-sama nating sulong ang kaunlaran ng bayan.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.
Bye.
You did good. Okay. Bye-bye po. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Congratulations.
Thank you po.